Hello everyone, my name is Nerily Duffy and I'm the Head of Digital Communications and Marketing here at Carlow College, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the first lecture in our Leaving Cert lecture series for 2024-25. This lecture series has been designed to complement your studies across a range of Leaving Cert subjects, including English, history, politics and society, classical studies, and religious education. In today's lecture, we'll be focusing on the poetry syllabus for English with Dr. Derek Coyle, taking a closer look at two poets, Gerard Manley Hopkins and Patrick Kavanagh. Dr. Derek Coyle is a published poet and lecturer here in Carlow College in English and creative writing. He has published two poetry collections of his own, Reading John Ashbery at Costa Coffee Carlow in 2019, and more recently, his new book, Sipping Martinis Under Mount Leinster. In terms of the webinar, there is a Q&A button in the Zoom webinar where you can post questions during the lecture, and we'll have time at the end to put a few questions to Derek to answer for you at the end. So please feel free to put questions in the Q&A box. We'll also be publishing the full lecture on YouTube afterwards, and we'll send the link along with the lecture slides out to all the attendees who registered. So now I'd like to hand over to Dr. Derek Coyle for today's lecture.
Well, thanks very much, Nerily, and a big welcome to all our Leaving Certificate students facing their Leaving Cert in the months ahead, and to their teachers. So I want to focus in on two very different poets, and actually I tell you what, I'll get my first slide up there. Hold on, there we go. And we have Hopkins on our left, and we can see there he's a Jesuit priest. And we've Patrick Kavanagh on the right, who is a small farmer, County Monaghan. Hopkins at the end of the 19th century, Kavanagh in the middle of the early to middle of the 20th century, and a cobbler, by the way. His father repaired shoes and made shoes. So two very different poets, two very different countries, two different histories, and yet this remarkable form, the sonnet, will contain and express the experiences that these two very different writers want to explore. So we'll have a look at that. Now, just to say that Hopkins, I'm going to focus in on two of his sonnets, Spring and God's Grandeur, and I'm going to take it that you know these sonnets reasonably well and that you've read them before, and this isn't your first introduction to them. So I'm going to give overviews, picking out similarities and maybe differences between the poems, and then I'm going to focus in on Patrick Kavanagh's two sonnets, Inniskeen Road, July Evening, and his sonnet Epic. And again, I'm going to take it that you know these poems quite well, and I'm going to focus in on shared characteristics between those two poems and differences. And then by the end, look at similarities and differences between the two poets' respective handling of the form. Okay, so the first thing we need to say about Hopkins in a way that's important to understanding his poetry is that he was a priest, and not a very fashionable vocation necessarily these days, although it was once upon a time in Ireland. But he had a theological training, so he's been influenced by significant teachers in the church. And the first is the medieval theologian St. Thomas Aquinas, and a medieval British, Scottish philosopher, theologian John Duns Scotus. Now, what's common to both of those figures is they were interested and influenced by the great Greek philosopher Aristotle. So he was common to both of those. Now, both of them were interested in what we might call, or they called in medieval philosophy, the quiddity of things. The quiddity of things. I've highlighted that there in your screens in red. Quiddity of things, which from their point of view meant that God was present in everything. And this idea flows through all of Hopkins' poetry. We can encounter and experience God through nature, is a very fundamental idea of his. And the variety and diversity of the created material world, its distinctive character reflects different aspects of the being of God. So we can encounter something of the reality of God in a daffodil, and we can encounter something of the reality of God in a cloud, and there are different aspects of God made manifest in the material world. So that's the idea. The quiddity of things, we'll come back to this notion, but just realize that God moves through everything and can be encountered in everything, and everything is a unique expression of aspects of God is the fundamental idea. And you need to grasp that idea to appreciate where Hopkins is coming from in his poetry. So quiddity is a noun meaning a thing, an aspect of reality. In philosophy, it means the inherent nature or essence of someone or something. And it can also mean its distinctive feature, its peculiarity, by which we might talk about somebody's quirks and quiddities. Now, all of that sounds terribly abstract. Let's look at what that means when we encounter a poem by Hopkins. So we'll look at his poem, or I'll mention how this is relevant to his poem, Spring. So in that poem, Hopkins tries to capture the distinctive nature of spring. What is spring like as an experience? Well, it's full of energy. It's the resurrection after the winter. It's a dynamic and lively season in which life is starting to come back after the winter. So it's infused with energy. Now, he'd understand that as God's presence flowing through things. Now, a good statement of that idea in Hopkins is the actual opening line of God's grandeur. The world is charged with the grandeur of God. Now, that would be a good line to use actually in relation to spring, because spring demonstrates how the world is charged with the grandeur of God. If you were to learn one line from a Hopkins poem for your exams, that might be a good one to learn, right? The world is charged with the grandeur of God. Charged meaning like an electrical current is the metaphor implied there. It's pulsing with energy. Now, spring tries to capture that energy, right? So the distinctive nature of spring is revealed in his poem. Its quiddity, its actual character, what it's like is what he's after. So that's the general notion of spring in the poem. What is its particular features and characteristics, and can I capture that in language? Then that's the more general overview of the poem. When he gets into specific details in the poem, he tries to capture the distinctiveness of more minute things. So, for example, the thrush's eggs look little low heavens. So he's implied they're a simile. They look like little low heavens. Look at this very rich alliterative line there, by the way. Look little low. And look at the vowels and look and low, but we'll come back to Hopkins's language. I won't rush ahead there enthusiastically. But thrush's eggs look little low heavens. So he's trying to capture what a thrush's eggs look like and what's distinctive about them. And he's implicitly comparing them to an aspect of the sky, connecting them back to the sky, which is blue. And we'll see an image of thrush's eggs in a little bit, and we'll know that they're blue as well. So that's a distinctive feature of a thrush's eggs, distinguishing them from the eggs of other birds. And then he gives us a second simile, the song of the thrush. It strikes like lightnings to hear him sing. Okay, so the song of the thrush has the energy, dynamism, illumination that comes with a lightning strike. It might mean it comes at you in surprising ways as well. There are a number of different dimensions to that comparison. Now, by the way, maybe it's been pointed out to you by your teachers, that is also another good example of what we call synesthesia. Synesthesia, I'll actually spell that one out for you now. Synesthesia, synesthesia, synesthesia. It doesn't sound like a terrible disease or anything like that, but synesthesia is the confusion or mixing of the senses. So some people, when they hear musical notes, see colors. When they hear D sharp or something, they see red. So it means that you experience one sense through another. Apparently it's to do with neural networks being confused in the brain. It's a common enough experience. But he tells us that we hear lightning strikes. Now, lightning is a visual thing. We hear thunder. We don't normally hear lightning, but we're hearing this lightning. It's like lightnings to hear him sing, he tells us. So the senses are blended or mixed up there. An example of synesthesia. So there's one for you there. So the distinctiveness of these aspects of nature are brought home to us here. The distinctiveness of the eggs of the thrush and the distinctiveness of its sound. So different aspects of the thrush's uniqueness is being explored by Hopkins here, in an instance of him exploring the quiddity, the distinctive inherent essence of what a thrush is like. Its song sounds like this, not like anything else, and its eggs are like this, not like anything else. So there are aspects of quiddity as we see Hopkins explore it. Now, I just want to give you a general sense of, well, some phrases that you can use to describe or talk about Hopkins, right? So I'll give you this line here, that Hopkins writes a poetry of intensification. I think that's a good way to describe maybe his overall impact or effect, right? So a poetry of I'll actually move a little box out of my way there for a moment. We're just going to do that. A poetry of intensification. So look at the striking diction of his sonnets. Now, diction is a good word to use, and I'm going to use it across today's talk. So diction means the specific word choice of a poet. And poets are, their distinctive poetic personalities is often revealed in their diction choices. So when you start to look at the diction of a poet, you can start to talk about that poet's voice, how they speak and how they sound. That's often conveyed through their distinctive use of language. So Hopkins really alters the poetic diction of his poems. Now, I'll look at examples in a minute, but he enriches the diction. He really stretches the type of words that he can bring into his poems. For example, to bring in the word rinse, for example, in the context of describing a bird song. Rinsing is normally associated with washing something, but it could mean drench and surrounded by. In some sense. So it could make sense, or does make sense, to describe a bird song that way, although it's unusual to do so, and to ring the last note of something. So rinse and wring comes from washing clothes, and that's unusual to bring that diction into a poem to describe nature. So that's a remarkable way that he alters poetic diction and enriches it and stretches it out to do something new. Now, the other remarkable feature of Hopkins' poetic practice is the incredible sonic density of his poems. That's maybe a good phrase for you to use and consider. The sonic density, it means the very dense sounds that he compacts into very small spaces. So when we look at rinse and wring, we realize he's bringing in language there, diction from washing clothes. We don't expect to see that in a poem about nature and celebrating spring. And he's using that to describe the thrush's sound as it strikes the ear. And we don't expect that. But look at the words more closely, and we notice that the letters on the sound rin is in both words. It's in rinse and ring. Sounded slightly different with that G sound at the end of ring, but it's still there. And we notice that doubling up of his sound. To put these sounds very close to each other is kind of risky. It's almost like the note is so close to what we've just heard before. Would you not go for something contrasting or different? Now, they are subtly different. That ring is not quite the same as rinse, but they echo each other, like a bird song, by the way, perhaps. So we see a doubling up of sounds there in the rinse and ring, and that's distinctive and daring, right? Now, I'm sure you've studied this closely when you're reading Hopkins, but this is a way to describe what he's doing, a poetry of intensification. Look at his intense assonance in spring, right? We've the rich vowel sounds early on in the sonnet. When weeds in wheels shoot long and lovely and lush. Now, it's a very lush line, by the way, itself. But when weeds in wheels shoot long and lovely and lush, right? We hear the double E sounds in weeds and wheels. And that's echoed but altered in the shoot. So when weeds in wheels shoot long and lovely and lush, we hear the vowel sounds, and there's the vowel sounds in long and lovely and lush, those broad vowel sounds that we hear there. Okay, and that's got a lovely rich sonic boom to it, or a sonic density, as I'm saying. And allied to that, we have the rich alliteration of the lines. So long, lovely, lush with their L sounds, but even before the comma, when, weeds, wheels, we have the W sounds there at the front of the words. And we have a good example of alliteration. So assonance, as you know, is playing with the vowel sounds, and that's very dense and intensified typically in a Hopkins poem. And then we have the consonants, which also is very intense and dense in Hopkins. So we see the intense consonants in a line like a strain of the earth's sweet being in the beginning, right? A strain of the earth's sweet being in the beginning. So we see the TR sound in strain. See that? STRAIN. We see the TR sound, and that's slightly reversed, but it's there in earth. EARTH, but RT slightly in reverse, right? So consonant sounds, the non-vowel sounds being carried across the line there, but also the alliterative be, sweet being in the beginning. Now, I was thinking over earlier, sort of in a moment, a flash of lightning, I could see that being be connected with the beginning. So being is the existence of something, and being comes into being at the beginning. So there's a philosophical or theological doubling up going on there in those terms. And I'd say he was very thrilled with himself that he managed to actually connect those two words in his poem. There's a sonic connection, but there is also a theological connection between the two of them. The earth's being, its existence, its isness, the fact it's here, starts at the beginning. So he has managed to connect those two words there. Okay, now we can trace out certain patterns in the diction choices of Hopkins, and that's always a good thing to do, and that can actually help you figure out the tone and the mood of the poem, or parts of the poem. So when you look at God's grandeur, the first four lines, now I'll use these technical terms from the sonnet, but I'll explain them a little bit more as we go on. So don't worry about that too much at the moment. But we look at the first four lines of God's grandeur, and we notice that the diction is very positive, right? It's very upbeat and positive associations. So you can pick out all the really positive words in that first quatrain, the first four lines of God's grandeur. So we have charged, grandeur, God, flame, shining, greatness. And even words that might be negative, like ooze, shock, and crushed, they actually become positive in the way that Hopkins describes them, and the context that he provides for them in the poem. So they become actually strangely positive terms, or they might originally sound perhaps negative, but crushed it becomes a positive, as the oil of the olive oozes out when it's been crushed. But in the second quatrain, we get a shift in the diction, and it becomes negative, as he's given out about the way humans have destroyed the world with the Industrial Revolution, the Second Industrial Revolution in the late 19th century. So he gives us trod repeat 3 times, powerful list of 3. I look at the sonic list of 3 in a way, between seared, bleared, and smeared, with their long E sounds connecting those: seared, bleared, smeared. Okay, and their drawn out sound as part of their negative impact. And we've toil, smudge, smell, and bear there, none of which are positive. So that's just tracing out some of the associations of the diction in our poems. Now, the second way we can look at the poem Spring and trace out the diction in this poem. So the octave, the first 8 lines of that poem, and then we have the tercet, so the sestet, as you know, in the sonnet. Don't worry, I'll talk about this again in a minute. Is the last 6 lines, often broken down into 2 bunches of 3. We have tercets, tercets, 3 lines equals 6, and we have quatrain, quatrain, 4, 4 equals 8 of the octave, right? But in the octave, so for most of this poem, the first 8 lines and most of the next 3, so that's 11 lines of the poem, his diction's mainly positive, and this generates an exuberant celebratory tone in the poem Spring. It's hard to be negative about springtime, unless you're T.S. Eliot, but that's another day's discussion. But anyway, beautiful, spring, long, lovely, lush, heavens, sing, blooms, richness, flare, fling, juice, joy, sweet, innocent, mayday, worthy, winning. They're all hugely positive words with very positive energy and associations, right? So that poem is mainly exuberant and celebratory until the end. It's only near the really latter end of the poem that we encounter a little bit of negativity, and I'll talk about why that comes in a moment. But just at the tail end of the first tercet and throughout the second tercet, heading into the last part of the poem, we get these maybe slightly more negative sounding words: cloy, cloud, sour, and sinning. So when we look at the balance in that poem, it's overall a very positive and celebratory poem. So here's another phrase that we can use standing back from Hopkins to describe what he's doing. So Hopkins is paradoxically an innovative conservative. That's a slightly paradoxical term. Innovative means to bring in something new. Conservative means to keep things the way they are. So how can he be both these things simultaneously? Well, he is, depending on what aspect of his poetic practice you want to emphasize. So in the red, I've put the innovative bit, and I've captured the conservative bit in the green here in our paragraph about this. So Hopkins is anarchic and innovative when it comes to poetic form. So he stretches the sonnet, wants to do remarkable new things with it that we haven't really seen before, and he does, but he is conservative and traditional in his thematic concerns. So the idea he's interested in, God and religion and the presence of God in his poetry, is not a new idea, dates back a long way. And he shares that idea with an awful lot of great poets who came before him, as we will see, or I'll argue here. So Hopkins anticipates the future, what's coming with modernism in the 20th century, where poets become much more experimental and more abstract, and he anticipates this modernist experimentation with the great energy and dynamism of his language, with its emphasis on sound and how he stretches the poetic form of the sonnet out to its limits. These striking line breaks in unusual places. For example, the second line of God's grandeur running into the third, the third line running into the fourth. It gathers to her greatness like the ooze of oil, crushed, full stop. It's a really strong emphasis on that crushed out there on its own after the run-on line or the line break there. That's quite an unusual move, and we may not have seen anything quite like that before. So he stretches the poetic form of the sonnet to its limits. However, he looks backward in recalling the religious traditions of poetry in the sonnet, and he is one of the greatest religious poets in the tradition. But this is a tradition that goes back as far as John Milton, John Donne, and George Herbert, poets of the 17th century, and Milton being one of the great sonneteers in English, if not the greatest of the sonneteers, and a very important religious poet as well. So this is a long tradition that Hopkins is part of and which he continues. So that indicates his sense of tradition and belonging to what has existed already in the past. So he's paradoxically an innovative conservative, we might call him. Now, there is a pattern that we can detect in Hopkins, which I think it's good to pick up on. Now, his poems are in a very demanding form, the Petrarchan sonnet as we know it. I'll talk more about that in a minute. And in his demanding Petrarchan sonnets, he typically wants to set out the beauty and glory of the world in the octave. So we'll see him celebrating the world and its beauty in the octave, the first 8 lines, the first part of the poem, as you find it in Spring. Now, he will mention in the second quatrain of his octave in God's Grandeur that humans have damaged God's creation and world through industrialization. So while he wants to celebrate the beauty and glory of the world, it's been disrupted, or we've lost our way with industrialization, as he mentions it in God's Grandeur. However, in the two sonnets we're considering by Hopkins today, in the sestet, the poem turns in a new direction and he reorientates the reader towards God. In Spring, he suggests that salvation has come into the world through the figure of Jesus Christ, and something Christ-like in freshness and beginning can be found in Spring. And even if we have damaged the world in God's grandeur, the presence of the Holy Spirit protects the world and will help it renew itself and rejuvenate itself. He has faith and confidence and hope that that's going to happen. So the Holy Spirit's protecting the world even as humans have damaged it terribly through the Industrial Revolution. So this is a typical pattern in those two poems, and it's good to spot that. And in that sense, they're both similar or share similar characteristics. Now, I've mentioned once or twice already that Hopkins' poems are in the form of what we call the Petrarchan or Italian sonnet. Now, it's slightly more difficult form in English to carry out. Long story short, English lacks these inflections, little word endings that are common in the Romance languages of France, French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, Romanian. Actually, they're all Romance languages derived from Roman culture, Latin, and they have strong inflections. Long story short, in the history of English, inflections fall away and become less important. Now, this means that English is sort of short on rhyming words compared to the Romance languages, and a sonnet is invented in Italy. It's relatively easy to do in Italian. It becomes harder to do in English because of the shortage of rhymes. So the English have to modify the sonnet over time, and hence we come up with a variation called the English sonnet, which is slightly easier. But the most ambitious of English poets, Milton, Hopkins, Wordsworth, have tried to write Petrarchan sonnets, and they have been successful, even if that form is a challenge. Now, the rhyme scheme typically is ABBA, ABBA, CD, CD, CD. And Hopkins, I was noticing in Spring, carries out actually a fairly daring innovation there in his sestet, because he goes for beginning, sinning, and winning, which echoes with the ring, fling, sing in the octave. So actually, he manages to write that poem in just 3 rhymes, which is a major technical feat in English and very difficult and daring to do. Milton didn't try that, and neither did Wordsworth, I can tell you, 2 of the greatest sonneteers before Hopkins. Now, God's Grandeur is typical of this Italian Petrarchan sonnet, although it's there also in Spring. So here's the language for it. You have an octave, 8 lines with 2 quatrains, and then you have the sestet with 6 lines. Now, here's typically what happens within those sections of the poem. And we're going to see that Patrick Kavanagh sticks pretty much to this plan. So it's good if you can grasp the concept or the plan. Generally, the octave opens in the first quatrain with a statement or a proposition about things. Here's how things are looking. It's very declarative in God's grandeur, in an end-stop sentence with a full stop right at the end. Quite unusual to open a poem with an end-stop line. He says, the world is charged with the grandeur of God. That's his opening statement or proposition. I believe this to be true. And the whole poem is going to develop or respond according to that idea. Now, he develops that in he fleshes out that idea in the first quatrain. Then we get a development of the issue. Here can be a problem with this, or here's something we need to consider related to that. And we get a further extending out of the idea in the second quatrain. And then the sestet of the poem provides a resolution of the dilemma. Very clearly in God's grandeur, the problem at stake is humans have disrupted God's plan and destroyed his creation or damaged it with the second industrial revolution. But Hopkins believes that the Holy Spirit is moving through the world, protecting the world like a mother bird protecting her eggs in the nest, and nature always has this rejuvenating potential because it's related to the powerful energies of the creator itself that pulls through it. Nature will recover and will come back. So, and for all this, nature is never spent. It will always renew itself. Okay, now we're getting tight for time, perhaps here. But anyway, look, we'll plough on, as the man says, and just talk a little bit more about some of the theological ideas in Hopkins' poem. So, according to Duns Scotus, our theologian that Hopkins is very fond of and he studied greatly, everything in God's creation has its own essence, its own particular unique thing, its thisness, what it is, what he calls its hasietas, and it's put there by the creator. Now, we can know God by approaching the distinctiveness of things that are an expression of an aspect of the creative being of the universe that has manifested them or made them possible in some sense. So we can know God and come closer to him by knowing more about and coming closer to his creation. So that's his idea. So haseity is a person's or object's thisness, the individualizing difference between the concept a man, the idea of man, let's say, and the idea of Socrates as a specific person, or he is a unique individual, that he shares certain characteristics with all men, but he has his own distinctive peculiarities, the things that make him who he is. So that's haseity. Or haseity. So whereas haseity refers to aspects of a thing that make it a particular thing, a thrush is a thrush. Quiddity, as we referred to it earlier, is the universal qualities of a thing, its whatness, or the aspects of a thing it may share with other things, and by which it may form part of a genius of things. So that is, a thrush is a bird, right? So there are thrushes, which are species of birds, and then there might be thrushes that have their own distinctive character and so on, right? That make them stand out and are unique to them. So look, there are some of the general ideas with Scotus. Now I'll try and tease those out in the next slide or two, exactly what this looks like when we start to read Hopkins. But inspired by Scotus and these ideas, Hopkins developed his own terms or words, right? Now he used the word instress to describe the unique spark, the God-given energy to be found in every created thing. So the unique spark, the God-given energy to be found in each created thing, he called instress. And then Hopkins called Inscape the impression that instress makes on us as we examine the creation more closely. So as we encounter Inscape in the creation, it has an instress or effect back on us as we encounter it. Hence, we should encounter it and get close to it because we are participating in the energy of God and God's creativity and expression. So by these means, Hopkins' descriptive language is understood to be a form of homage to God through appreciating the distinctive features of his creation. So his poems, by capturing the uniqueness and distinctiveness of God, are paying homage to God for creating this wonderful, diverse world to enjoy and appreciate. Now, that all might sound terribly abstract and far removed from what you're doing for your Leaving Cert there in poetry. So I'll try and tie this down in relation to Hopkins and some of his images in the poems that you're familiar with. So in the poem Spring, the season of spring is dynamic and lively. It's energetic and moving. Right? Look at the verbs in the poem. The weeds shoot. The song of the thrush rinses and rings the ear, appearing to wash us or wash over us with sound. Now the sound of the thrush strikes, and the blue of the sky is all in a rush with richness. Great line break there. We pause after rush with richness. Hear those R sounds, right? So these verbs suggest movement, energy. Nature's alive and dynamic, as I've said. So each component part of this spring picture is full of instress. Let's apply that word used by Hopkins here. It has its own unique energy. So as he breaks spring down into these component parts, he's seeing energy and dynamism. He would call that instress, right? The movement of God's energy and things. Now, when we take all this together looking at the poem, we are struck by the aliveness of spring, its dynamism, and the poem's lively language and stretching of the language to a breaking point tries to capture this. Right? He's trying to capture the aliveness of spring, its dynamism. Now he's chasing after a charge, he's chasing after an energy, and his lines are full of movement as he tries to do this, right? So, by this means, Hopkins tries to capture the experience of Inscape, the impression all of this makes on our own senses, and which he is trying to convey to us through his poem. So he's trying to generate an experience of Inscape, which is the type of experience you have when you're out amongst nature, encountering all its energy and diversity. When you're sitting in your study or your classroom or wherever you're reading this poem, and he wishes to convey something of that pulsing energy, and he does it through language and line breaks and run-on lines and all the means that a sonnet or poem will give him to try and capture this unique experience of the living, vibrant energy of the world, charged and pulsing with God's energies, if you like. And he wants to create the experience of Inscape for you through the poem. Okay, now to use that term we used earlier, hesitate, the hesitate of the thrush's eggs is to be found in their blueness. So the distinctive feature of a thrush's eggs that makes it stand out from any other birds is this blueness, and with that speckling of black or whatever. This is the distinctiveness, the quirky character of the thrush's eggs. Okay, that's a quick run through the sonnet in Hopkins, looking at two of his poems on your syllabus. We now want to look at Patrick Kavanagh when calling the contrary sonneteer from Monaghan. So we've moved from the end of the 19th century, albeit Hopkins did live in Dublin at the end of his life, and he did write his famous terrible or dark sonnets there. But Kavanagh is in the 1930s or thereabouts here in Ireland up to the 60s. Now, Inniskeen Road, beautiful poem about a country dance. It has a Shakespearean rhyming scheme inside what we might call a Petrarchan envelope, as I will argue. Now, I'll talk about that in the next slide or two, and we'll break that down. Wish we were at a dance there, having a bit of cracker, cycling out the roads of Monaghan. Inniskeen's lovely spot in Monaghan. On a lovely evening, lovely place to be. Now, this is an early Kavanagh sonnet from his early collection of poems, The Ploughman and Other Poems. Okay, so let's have a look at that in a bit more detail. There's an image of Petrarch. Of course, he's coming from 13th century Italy, so we don't have photographs of him. But here's the Petrarchan envelope or shape to Kavanagh's poem. It has an octave, it's got 8 lines. It's got 2 quatrains, which you'll be able to identify there. Each one of them has an end stop. It means that the quatrain is a full contained sentence. At the end of the 4 lines, you see a little full stop. That's an end stop. And so each quatrain is a complete sentence. So we get 2 of those making up the octave. This is a typical Petrarchan, or is the Petrarchan shape. We have a volta or turn with I have what every hope hates. There's suddenly a shift in the speaker. There's no one apparently present speaking, no I in that first octave. The I comes into play with the volta or the turn as we enter into the sestet, or the last 6 lines of the poem. So we see a Petrarchan shape, which we recognize from Hopkins. He has this in similarity with Hopkins, but Kavanagh has opted for the slightly easier rhyming scheme of William Shakespeare there, the English sonnet. He didn't invent that sonnet, but he did write some beautiful examples. So in honour of their great writer, the English have called it the Shakespearean sonnet. By the way, Petrarch didn't invent the sonnet, but again, he wrote some very fine examples. So the Italians talk about the Italian sonnet or the Petrarchan sonnet. So we 4 rhymes across the octave in a Shakespearean sonnet. 1 pattern for the first quatrain and another pattern for the second. So he's opening up a bit of rhyming space there. and he goes A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D. Right, now that would be the total number of sounds across a Petrarchan sonnet over 14 lines, but we've gone out to the full 4 sounds in the first 8 lines. Then we have 3 rhymes across the sestet, split into a quatrain of EF, EF, and wrapping up in very Shakespearean fashion with a couplet that the Petrarchan sonnet wouldn't really recognise or understand. And we've gone out as far as G. Right, and we've got ourselves an extra 3 rhymes there with a total of 7 rhyming words, compared to Hopkins' typical 4 rhyming words in its more classic and challenging Petrarchan sonnets. So purely from a rhyme and scheme type of point of view, Hopkins' sonnets are slightly more challenging than what Kavanagh has delivered here. So that's just look at a quick difference between these 2 sonnets that they've used. Now, interestingly, we see Kavanagh deliver the classic argument of the sonnet here in this poem too. So let's have a look at that a bit more closely. So we've the octave, the first quatrain, we expect a statement of the problem, the dilemma, or what the poet's proposing. We expect that in the first quatrain, and it's actually beautifully disguised and very well presented by Hopkins here, or sorry, Kavanagh, and it's the knowledge of a dance in Billy Brennan's barn. So that's what we're being told is happening. There's a dance in Billy Brennan's barn. Now, it's expressed very imaginatively in very memorable and quotable phrases. Beautiful language, very elevated in Kavanagh's poem, the half-taught code of mysteries. So there's as much winking and nodding and gestures as there is physical talk, perhaps, about the excitement of the dance and what's going on there. And the wink and elbow language of delight. Very beautiful, original expressions, distinctive to Kavanagh's poem. And if you're a really good poet, you want people quoting lines from your poem, and those lines are very memorable and very quotable. You won't ever forget them, many of you. Now, the second quatrain develops this idea. Now, this is following the very same structure as actually we have seen of the idea being developed as we've seen in Hopkins. So we expect development now in the second quatrain. Well, what does this all mean? What are its consequences? Well, the poet discovers that the place is now deserted, he's isolated, and the scene is observed by the lonely poet, and he's left here all alone. So this is the upshot of the situation described in the first quatrain. Here's what this means to this poet. This is the consequence of that. So then the sestet, we expect a resolution of the dilemma, the final 6 lines of the poem. And the poet tells us about his understanding of the circumstance, what it means to him and for him. He has complex feelings about it, perhaps, as it turns out. Look at his phrase, every blooming thing, which is an example here of a double entendre. And it might be deflationary, ironically pulling us down slightly. So he appreciates the blooming of nature. Nature is blossoming. It's a July evening. Summer's at its height. But perhaps he's also swearing in a mild swear, blooming hell type thing. And the tone might be one of disgruntlement. He's slightly unhappy with the situation here. That's the consequence of the situation that he finds himself in. But we see Kavanagh here, just like Hopkins, follow the classic argument of the sonnet. Now, as a matter of interest, it's always good to hear another poet on a poet. Patrick Kavanagh was a massive influence on Seamus Heaney. Seamus Heaney has helped actually to make Patrick Kavanagh very famous around the world, because he became a very famous poet, and people like to learn more about his influences. Now, he wrote 2 important essays about Kavanagh. You can find them in his prose writings if you're interested in chasing this up. But the first one came from his book Preoccupations, originally published in 1980 there. But it's just interesting what Heaney has to say here. So I'll read through what he says, and I'll just paraphrase it slightly for you here. So on this poem, he notes, the power of the negated phrases turn out a man or woman, and especially a footfall tapping secrecies of stones, works against the solitude and establishes a ghostly populous atmosphere, and thus prepares us for the poet's double-edged feelings in the sestet, of being at once marooned and in possession. Now, interestingly, what's Heaney saying there? Well, the place isn't as empty in some sense as Kavanagh might appear to be saying on the surface. His phrasing, footfall tapping secrecies of stone, here's an echo, an after effect ringing through the quatrain. So strangely, there's a ghostly presence of a human, even as Kavanagh is describing people not being there. And that might turn out a man or woman. So people are there, but they're not there at the same time. It's an interesting reading from Heaney. And the poet belongs and yet is isolated at the same time. And he has captured this place and he has captured it really beautifully, an aspect of it. But at the same time, he feels not a part of the place. So this is sort of a complex zone that Kavanagh finds himself in. He's celebrating this place that he doesn't feel fully at home in, and yet he knows it really well and intimately. Interestingly, just then a further note from Heaney. See that picture there where he looks remarkably like Kavanagh from the opening picture of our slides. Apparently Heaney really regretted allowing those pictures to be taken. He felt it created a false image of him and his poetry, but that's just an aside for you on Seamus Heaney. But here's Heaney again on Inniskeen Road, a July evening. It is a love poem to a place written towards the end of the affair, and it is also one of the earliest and most successful of Kavanagh's many poems about the nature of the poetic life. Again, that's an interesting and insightful comment from Seamus Heaney. So a type of love poem, that's interesting, but it's a love poem to a place. But maybe as it's gone on for quite a while, maybe it's become a little jaded, a little bit tired. Maybe both are exhausted with each other. Or Kavanagh with Inniskeen with Kavanagh. It's time for a change, and you think about moving on to Dublin, London, after moving on to another place to live and write about. But it's one of his most successful early poems about the nature of the poetic life. So what it's like to be a poet will be a theme that preoccupies Kavanagh, and this is one of his earliest takes on this phenomenon, or what it's like to be a poet. Okay, a few thoughts on July evening in Inniskeen Road, and we'll just finish up with Epic here by Kavanagh, a very famous poem with its own very quirky rhyming scheme, with many half rhymes and approximate rhymes is how I would describe it. So the way I read the rhyming scheme, I've chimed up times with claims. It's that IMS sound in both words, and I've connected owned to land. It's that NED sound, and I'm reading that as an ABBA. Now I connect up the soul with stones, it's the SO sound perhaps in those words, and the scene with steel, the double E sound in both of those. And for me, that's given me a CDDC. Happy to disagree slightly here with Stephen Regan's book on the sonnet, where he gives us just a slight variation on that second quatrain, but I disagree with him, but I won't go into that here. We're tight for time. And on the sestet, we go with which such inclined mind, and I've checked in with Monaghan people and listened to Kavanagh reading the poem, and it's the Gurchin is how you pronounce that, with importance, and it's the ORT sound in the middle of the words that Kavanagh's connecting up, and that gives us an EFGFEG. I've read some commentary online about this poem saying it has no rhyming scheme, and I just don't believe that that's correct. So watch out for what you read online. It's not always accurate or particularly good, so check your sources, as we're always saying, and make sure that you have a reliable guide online. Not all of them are, so watch out for that. We've the volta or turn, as we call it, at which is very unusual there at the end of line 9, and he puts it right at the very end of the line, which is just hanging there, letting us think about it for a second before we run on to finish that line, which was more important, we wonder. Now, this is a late Kavanagh sonnet, comes from his 1960 great collection of poetry, Come Dance with Kitty, Stabling, and other poems. So it's a good deal later in his writing career and life than the earlier Inniskeen Road. Now, I just want you to pick out some of the specialised dictions, the way he plays with language across the poem, and he draws from lots of interesting domains. So we just have a quick look at that. He takes words from measuring land, rood, he uses that in the poem, meaning 60 square yards or so. He has march there, which means a boundary line. He takes terms from war, no man's land, pitchfork armed, cast steel could suggest a weapon, although he's actually describing a plough. And look at his use of colloquial speech, the spoken language, and the poetry and music of it in his native Monaghan. Damn your soul. We can imagine that being expressed very powerfully by locals. And here's the march along these iron stones, as one of the characters is pointing out the boundary line, and he's speaking those words in the quotation marks. Now look at the clever opening line of the poem, which I think is really well handled. I have lived in important places, times. Now, the way what's implied there is I have lived in important places, important times. He's elided out that second important, but it's hovering in there, sitting there, and we put it in there even though he hasn't. Okay, now the title of the poem is interesting. He's using it as a noun and an adjective simultaneously in his poem. So we could talk about an epic poem. There's an irony in calling this poem epic because it's only a sonnet, that most minuscule of forms, only 14 lines. An epic poem is generally a huge big poem. And then an adjective can be an epic event. And his epic event is men fighting over a rood of rock, as he calls it in the poem, somewhat ironically, as we might say. Now again, and we're nearly finished here now and ready for our questions. I hope you have a few for me, and I hope I'll be able to answer for you. But I want you to follow here exactly how this poem too develops the classic argument structure of the sonnet. So in the octave, we've the first quatrain, that first 4 lines, and he states his problem or dilemma, or his proposition. He wants us to think about this. Well, he's saying, I have known serious dilemmas resolved. Fights over that half a rood of rock. And he has a sort of mock heroic tone, recalling classic English poem, similar mock heroic poem, Alexander Pope's The Rape of the Lock. Now, in the second quatrain, we expect him to develop, push that idea out. And he does. And he gives us an example. I remember that time the Duffys fought with old McCabe. And this is an illustration of what had been stated or claimed in the first quatrain. Here's a specific example or instance of me in my time remembering a serious dilemma that people fought over and which was resolved. And the resolution of the dilemma is taken up by the last 6 lines of the poem. Was this more important than the Munich Agreement in 1938? I thought not, until I remembered Homer, who reminded me that pride, loyalty, rage live on in human hearts and stir up and motivate the passions, regardless of where you are, Munich or rural Monaghan. And to those involved, or Homer's Trojan War, by the way, for those involved, half an acre is worth as much as half a continent. If you love that acre, you know that acre, you want that acre, consider it yours, you're going to put up a fight for it, and that's important to you. And you're driven by intense human feelings, pride, loyalty, rage, and that's what the poet is interested in, what stirs the human heart. So to tie up our talk today, we're talking about the remarkable versatility of the sonnet form. It's a good phrase for you maybe to use. Look at how this form, 14 lines, invented by the Italians so long ago, 7 or 8 centuries ago now, it contains such diverse experiences as a local land row. That's epic, we've just looked at. The isolation of a rural artist in Ireland in the 1930s, that's Inniskeen Road, July evening, to the ecstatic apprehension of the divine in nature, such a different experience as experienced by a religious sensibility like that of Gerard, Manley, Hopkins, particularly Spring, but also God's grandeur. So these such diverse experiences captured in this remarkably diverse and flexible poetic form. Now look at the worlds it can reflect. We have rural Ireland, and then we have English pastoral landscape in Spring, and we see signs of the second industrial revolution in late Victorian or 19th century England in God's grandeur. Now look at the different linguistic registers the form is capable of capturing. We have the rural speech and idiom of Monaghan in Ireland in the early 20th century to that very distinctive poetic idiom that Hopkins totally owns himself and makes his own in his sonnets. We see 19th century England and we see early to mid 20th century Ireland captured in Kavanagh. So that's our talk on the sonnets. I'll now open up to questions. Nerly Duffy, will I stop sharing there, Nerly? Is that all right?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, I'll take that off there. Good. I hope we have a few questions. I hope we can answer, and I hope I didn't go too fast. I hope that was all right for people. They can always watch back.
Yeah, so we don't have any questions yet. So if people I'll just give a minute for people to pop in the questions, just in case they're thinking. But we'll also be putting this up on YouTube, and there is a comment feature there. So if you are showing it to a class later on, or anything like that, you can pop a question onto the video on YouTube, and I'll get Derek to give me an answer for it and post it back up for you.
Yeah, no problem. I'd be delighted to do that and follow up. I hope you enjoyed our little waltz through Hopkins and Kavanagh. You'll notice Nerly's accent there. She's originally from Australia. I'm not sure, but she may well have studied Hopkins in Australia. I'm not sure she studied any Patrick Kavanagh though.
Anyway, we don't have any questions, so I'll thank everyone who joined us today for our first lecture, and a special thanks to Derek for delivering a really insightful lecture there. For those of you who teach or are studying history, our next lecture will be on the 11th of November at 2 p.m. with lecturer in European history, Dr. Ida Milne, covering the rise of fascism. So this lecture is open to 5th and 6th year students and teachers, and you can register on our website at carlowcollege.e, and I'll also include a link in the follow-up email to this lecture. So this concludes today's lecture. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. Bye, everybody. Take care. Best of luck in your leaving cert.